Good afternoon, good evening in Ukraine. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ASN, and I'm here to welcome everyone to our second special panel about Russia's attack on Ukraine. The ASN is a scholarly association with membership and academic interests in both Ukraine and Russia. We stand in support of all those who are living under siege or displaced by the war in Ukraine, and we will continue to support our colleagues, scholars, students, researchers, everyone who is affected personally and professionally by this violence. This panel, which we titled Voices from Ukraine Under Siege, features the testimonies of our colleagues, young scholars on the ground from Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson. And I'd like to express my admiration and gratitude for our colleagues in Ukraine, Yuliya, Bidenko, Natalia, Kudriavtseva, Alexander. I don't see Alexander Rodniansky here. Hopefully he can join.
I'm here.
You're here. Okay. Welcome, Alexander. And Mariia, Shuvalova, and where is Timofii, Brik? Thank you, Olga Onuch, from the University of Manchester for moderating this discussion. And I would also like to thank Dominic Arel, Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Ottawa, who has helped to put this panel together and who is also going to say a few words. I'm going to hand it over to him, and then in just a minute, he will ask Olga Onuch to start moderating the conversation. Thank you, Dominic. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. Thank you to everyone joining us on this important event in terrible times. And I see we have quite an audience, even though it's in the nature now of the times that we have to put events at the last minute, literally. Ukraine being attacked. We have Natalia currently from a city under Russian military occupation. We have Yuliya literally on the run from east to west, currently in Khmelnytsky region, having fled the terrible bombing in Kharkiv. And we have 3 other guests from Kyiv. Just very briefly, I'm the director of the vASN annual convention. Many of the guests today are in principle in May on the program. But ASN also celebrates its 50th anniversary. It was created in 1972. There's a very, very important link. ASN, the Association for Study of Nationalities, was created by Ukrainians who fled Soviet aggression, Western Ukraine, during World War II. And through the Shevchenko Society in New York, and their contacts from other national groups of the Soviet Union, they created ASN. Stepan Horak was the founder. So there is this very deep link that links the entire association, which is of course much more than Ukrainian studies. And we cover 9 or 10 different geographical areas. But Ukraine has been historically at the root. We have a very active section of the program committee on Ukraine with Olga and Oksana Chevel, Henry, Paul Danieri, myself, and Olena Petrenko, and we were able to put together this wonderful panel. So thank you. I'll leave it now to the capable hands of Olga.
All right, thank you, Dominique, and thank you to all of our audience members for joining us today. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to speak to some of the rising stars of social science in Ukraine. These are individuals who have already long CVs and incredible publications, And I think not only can they help us with the voices from the ground perspective that we all are yearning to hear more about, but also because they have incredible sophisticated expertise and acumen in their respective fields. So we have devised a little bit of a plan, and we would like to first start off with short introductory statements where our panelists will tell us what they think are the three or so most important things that we need to look at. And first, we'd like to start off with Yuliya Bidenko, Associate Professor at Karazin Kharkiv National University in Political Science. Yuliya, please, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Many thanks for inviting me. I think that now Kharkiv is also in the focus of research community, of expert community, and of foreign media, because I would say that Kharkiv may be the city which was damaged and landed level down during previous 10 days, and I can't see any photos and pictures of Kharkiv and videos of attacks with Ukraine. Actually, I would say that Kharkiv maybe was a target for establishing a People Republic, so-called People Republic in 2014, but now it was obvious that city would be like a center of resistance. That is why I think Russian army is punishing the city. Actually, it was the center of civil society movement. It was the center to reintegrate IDPs from Donbass, and actually it was kind of a center of a new Ukrainian civic identity after the Euromaidan revolution. And due to the closure to the location of Kharkiv, I think it was damaged most. But it's not only the matter of location, it's also the matter of identity. And I think that Russian army and maybe Putin himself, they have their special attitude to Kharkiv, and that is why even Russian-speaking Ukrainians were massively punished, because they damaged more than 30 schools, more than 5 universities, and they were very cruel towards civilians. They created both damages from bomb shelling from the sky and land, and actually they created a huge humanitarian crisis there in Kharkiv.
Thank you, Yuliya. Next, we have Dr. Natalia Kudriavtseva, Associate Professor at Kherson National Technical University. Sorry, Natalia, I messed that up. Kryvyi Rih State Pedagogical University. You're on mute, Natalia.
Sorry. Let me start by briefly describing the situation here on the ground in Kherson. This city has been blocked by Russian troops since the very first day of the war. The train service stopped here on this very day. There was no actual possibility for evacuation. So it means that the population of Kherson is here. No one managed to escape. And since the very first day, the 3 town gates of Kherson have been blocked by the Russian troops, and the city inhabitants who tried to leave the city in private cars, they later said that they were fired at by Russians as they passed their roadblocks. Russian troops had besieged the city till the 1st of March, and on the day they attacked, the city managed to break through the territorial defense. And since then, Russian troops have been staying in Kherson, occupying several locations: the railway station building, the River Port Hotel, and Kherson Regional Administration building in the city center among them. The suburbs of Kherson were heavily shelled during the first 3 days. Unlike Kharkiv, Kherson, of course, was not shelled so much, not even, doesn't stand any comparison to Kharkiv, but the suburbs were shelled. And it was done during the heavy fighting over the bridge of Antonovka, connecting the left and the right banks for the river Dnipro. This bridge is a very important route for the Russians because it is the shortest route to the mainland Ukraine, to other regions, other oblasts, Mykolaiv and Odessa and Zaporizhia. That's why there was such a heavy fighting over this bridge. And Antonovka is the village located just beside the bridge, and many houses, it suffered a lot during this fighting. Many houses were ruined because of the shelling, because Russians used their Grad weapons, and at least one civilian is known to have been killed, but we don't know the exact numbers yet of people who died and who suffered. Several people were injured. The villages were later evacuated to Kherson by the city council, and now they are being taken care of here. Another major battle occurred on the 1st of March when Russian troops used heavy artillery on the city buildings and apartment blocks. According to the information provided by the city council, at least 35 civilians were killed. It's the number that we know, but it doesn't mean that it is the definite number. This is the minimum that we know today. And more than 100 people were injured in their apartments and on the streets when the Russian troops were entering the city on the 1st of March. And it's not only the city of Kherson that has been blocked by Russians, but also almost the whole territory of Kherson Oblast. Russian troops do not allow cars with food and medicines to reach the occupied territories, which means that Kherson and the biggest part of the region are now experiencing a humanitarian crisis. The shops and pharmacies in Kherson are selling out whatever is left. Smaller towns and villages have been in a by far more awful condition. They ran out of food and medicines, and many of them don't even have bread. By medicines, I mean the vital medicines such as insulin in the first place. Another major catastrophe is related to the impossibility of taking out dead bodies left on Antonovka Bridge and elsewhere. Russians do not collect their dead soldiers, nor they burn them in their mobile crematoriums. They simply leave them behind. First thing we need now is the long-awaited green corridors for the currently occupied cities, such as Mariupol, Volnovakha, and Kherson. Some of them are still being shelled by Russian missiles. Mariupol is begging to evacuate their civilians. Kherson is begging for the humanitarian aid to be allowed into the city so that we have food and medicines and do not starve to death. Obviously, Putin's plan is to organize another quasi-republic here. In Kherson Oblast, there are 17 Russian battalions right now here in Kherson Oblast. And by this, he means to force us to surrender to this so-called Kherson People's Republic by leaving us without medicines and food. Second, other countries must understand that it is not a local war. The world is too small to pretend that whatever is happening in one part of the world will not affect the others. Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe and sixth biggest one in the world. And there is also Yuzhno-Ukrainsk nuclear power plant in Mykolaiv Oblast. This region has now been continuously attacked. There are 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine. By shelling our nuclear plant, Russia has been threatening the survival of the whole world, not just Ukraine and its people.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Natalia, for a very sobering introductory comment. Next, we have Dr. Timofii Brik, who is assistant professor at Kyiv School of Economics. Timofii, the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I'm very happy to see my colleagues as well and to see that at least they are in safety now. So I'm quite lucky. I have decided to stay in Kyiv. A lot of people left the city immediately after during the first night or early morning of war. A lot of people decided to hit the road. My girlfriend and I have decided to stay because we are attached to our family. We wanted to be helpful as volunteers, or maybe we were just delusional. But now we stay because it is also rational. it is quite rational to stay in Kyiv, even though it is a target. And we read news right now that, you know, some battles are happening right now on the suburbs, in the suburbs of Kyiv. Nevertheless, right now Kyiv is quite protected, and you know it's better to stay here in shelter than travel on unprotected roads now. That's, or when something bad happens. So right now we are staying in Kyiv. Kyiv, as I said, is well protected. The supply chains work quite well. So first of all, it's simple calculus. You know, half of the city left, so there is food on shelves, and there is no panic, and people can buy medicine or food, fresh vegetables, milk, whatever. Second, there are still critical supply chains. I've seen with my own eyes, you know, how trucks were bringing food to subway stations, so people who stay there can get this food. It was quite dangerous in Kyiv during the first days of war. There were some troops on the streets of my, you know, of the neighborhood where I was born. I don't live there anymore, but I was born there, and there were, you know, fights. But it is much safer now. People are afraid. People are afraid that perhaps something could happen, like with Kharkiv. Yeah, maybe we could be bombed as Kharkiv. People are afraid of significant, massive attacks and saboteurs. But on the other hand, people, you know, stay strong. We have military, we have territorial defense, we have volunteers. Even civilians try to help. I mean, I know personally now more than one person who has called police on saboteurs. So it's not just from the news. I hear it from my, you know, very close friends and relatives that they were able to identify saboteurs, and the police arrested them. So, you know, civilians try to protect each other as well. Yeah, so right now I think in comparison to my other colleagues, I'm quite safe. Where my girlfriend and I were trying to follow, you know, the alarms, and I'm now in my shower. So this is our semi-shelter, but of course we have real shelters. We have basements, and we have subway stations nearby to go there if something bad happens. Yeah, I guess that's it. Over.
Thank you, Timofii, for telling us about the daily realities that you are facing. Next up, we have Mariia Shuvalova, who is a lecturer and PhD student at the National University of Kyiv, Mohyla.
Hi, can you hear me? Because my internet is not stable, so I will make really short introduction. I'm a literary scholar. Also, I work in an agency that provides localization of media content. And since the first day, our agency switched to providing services for Office of the President pro bono and to providing services for different organizations. So today, to make our panel more multidisciplinary and to make best use of my qualification, I will focus on propaganda, terminology, and what journalists and researchers should do while covering or even commenting war in Ukraine, as informational front is also a battlefront today, and staying near a safe place, I am trying to work 24/7, and that's what keep me in a good mood and keep me focused. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mariia. And so last but not least, we have Dr. Alexander Rodniansky, who's a university assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge, and one of the early co-founders of the Ukrainian Society back at LSE way back when. So, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I'll also be short. I think my internet is not very stable. So I have been active here also in Ukraine as in two capacities, essentially, primarily as a presidential advisor right now, and also as a supervisory board member of the State Savings Bank of Ukraine, so Oshad Bank. I'm currently on sabbatical leave from Cambridge, but I'm also still a scientist and working on my papers. So my normal sort of field of specialization is macroeconomics and finance. I speak a lot about monetary policy, and I have been active in that area in some sense here. But right now, the focus is obviously shifted. So at the bank, I'll give you some details. We're really facing extraordinary times. Our strategy during normal times was to privatize the bank. So we were really working hard on making sure Oshad Bank improves in terms of its balance sheets, in terms of its profit and loss, in terms of our strategy of diversifying away from state-focused enterprises or state-dependent enterprises. So we were moving towards the private sector. Right now, all of that is, of course, in shambles. So our strategy is out the window. We're just trying to make sure banking services are still operational. People can get their money. People can get their funds. We're trying to make sure that our employees are safe. So currently, we've had an update today. 80 of our branches have already been occupied. Some of them just destroyed, unfortunately, in Donetsk. That's 80 out of 1,600. So Oshad Bank is the biggest bank in Ukraine by branches, second biggest by assets. So it's a huge bank. And if we were talking about privatization and participation by the EBRD before, now we're talking, how do we save our people? And how do we make sure that the enemy doesn't get the cash, the physical cash that we have? So in war times, you have to burn the cash. So that's apparently what you do. And that's what we've been trying to do, but not always succeeding. So that's what's happening in terms of the financial sector. So we're working hard on making sure that the financial sector doesn't collapse. Our banks are operational. Oshad Bank also has a special function in that it takes care of cash in transit for all of the other banks in Ukraine at this sort of martial law time. So that's really challenging, and we're making sure so far we've succeeded. Our banking system has been more or less stable. Now, in terms of the other front, here it's really been nonstop in terms of the presidential office. So I've had, like all my colleagues, we've had to move way beyond our usual domain of responsibility. So I would usually just be responsible for economic policy, some advice, some strategic planning, financial policy primarily. Now it's really everything. So we discuss, obviously, we have a lot of discussions with our partners about sanctions, about support for Ukraine, about military matters. And here I would just like to make 2 points. So there's obviously, this is a special time, so we need two things. We need maximum military support that we can possibly get for Ukraine. And here the big issue was the no-fly zone. Now the West is hesitant to give us a no-fly zone. But I've been saying throughout, listen, if you think that the regime, the Russian regime, will just be some party that where we can reach an agreement and live happily ever after in peace, then that's an illusion. That's obviously naive. This is a regime and a party that has been lying and deceiving everyone all the way through for years. So like I said, they used to say there was no troops on Crimea. Next day there were troops on Crimea. 20th of February was the date when the troops were going to return back home from their exercises. They stayed, and then there was an invasion, and it was all just Western hysteria before. So this whole notion that we can somehow keep having a dialogue, a constructive dialogue, and find a peaceful solution, just like on the terms of that, just having peace and a mutual understanding and an interest for peace, that's naive. So what I'm saying is, even if the West doesn't want to engage now, it has to live up to the fact that sooner or later it will have to engage with this regime, right? This regime is not just going to disappear. And the sooner they understand that, the better. And so if they don't want to implement a no-fly zone, then they have to at least act like, stop giving the Russian side this advantage of being transparent and honest all the time. They have to do something in between, kind of act as the Russian regime does. So say that you don't give us a no-fly zone, but give us the capacities, the military facilities to effectively implement a no-fly zone by ourselves. That's one option, right? So we need medium to high air defense systems, which we don't have at the moment. We need a lot more in terms of air defense that we really are lacking, and that's one area where we need maximum support. The other area, and that's another part that we keep working on quite a lot, is the economic part. So we are getting a lot of support from our Western partners, the World Bank, the EU, and so on. That's good because we need to keep operating, we need to pay pensions, we need to deliver on our social obligations, etc. And obviously the economy is collapsing from the war, right? Infrastructure is completely destroyed. or getting completely destroyed and people are fleeing. So obviously we need maximum support. But that's just one part about the economics. The second part is we need to make sure that the other side, the Russian side, pays the maximum price it can pay. We need to make sure, and that's the strategy here, that at some point sooner rather than later, they cannot afford this war anymore, right? They have to run out of the funds, out of the money to be able to finance this war. And that's the strategy. We have to be as strong as we can in terms of the military, and at the same time, we have to help our side economically to the maximum extent, and we have to hurt the enemy side as much as we can in order for them to stop the war, because the war needs financing. So that's the priorities that we're working on, and here it's where important to impose sanctions. Unfortunately, we're seeing that the Western side is imposing a lot of sanctions, but not entirely all the sanctions that they could impose, especially when it comes to gas and oil, buying gas and oil, to really make sure that the funds are running out for the Russian machine, war machine. And I'll conclude on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That's a very succinct and powerful message. If we need a no-fly zone, we need money and support to save lives. If you can't stomach the no-fly zone, then do at least what you can to help Ukraine defend itself. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shift to a few questions and discussion between our panelists. And I would like to allow each of our panelists to answer whichever question they want to. If they don't feel that they have a great answer, they can skip it. But we would like to hear all your different voices on these queries. And first and foremost, you're all experts. You know, whether it is in sociology or political science or economics or anthropology or literature, you have this incredible in-depth knowledge. And I would like you to shed some light on the facts at hand as you are observing them through your analytical lens. How can your research, whether it's the research you've done to date or perhaps it is forthcoming, help us make sense and understand things that are happening on the ground as you observe them? Be they within Ukraine, amongst ordinary citizens, amongst political elite, or outside of Ukraine, be they in Russia or in the West. So why don't we start off with Yuliya first? What do you think, Yuliya?
Okay, many thanks. Well, I start with the focus of my research. It was and it is civil society in Ukraine, the implementation of Euro-integrational reforms on the ground and political elites and decentralization. And I am very glad that actually these reforms were successful, and it is cruel to say so, but the war is a kind of evidence of capabilities of the decentralized Ukraine to resist. And actually our civil society, which has like the very best assessment among all other post-Soviet countries, also now included. I would say that at the moment, during previous week, civil society in Ukraine expanded, and there are no more division between the mass society and civil society, because I would say that everyone included, and even those who left their cities and even those who left the country, they all included, and they try to build chains of supplies, of humanitarian aid. Even people who stay in Kharkiv, for example, they try to use their bikes, they try to use their cars to make some supplies to their neighbors. And actually, I was always critical to local political elites and even to Ukrainian government, but I should say that even I didn't expect such level of responsibility and such level of leadership. And that is why I think that decentralization reform was one of the most successful, because we've seen comparing small villages in Kharkiv, Kherson, Zaporizhia region, small towns and large cities, how people united and how they feel these responsibilities for their communities. And actually, even criticizing local elites for their populism on previous local elections, which were held in 2020, I would say that now the deputies of local councils, despite any political previous discussions or let's say belonging to different parties, they are acting all together. I want to express I want to express my appreciation to Kharkiv mayor. I didn't expect that the person will be so much included in all the processes, and they very successfully cooperate with the state administrations on the ground, and they all included in the chains with the local civil society, with international partners. And actually, I would say that Russian propaganda thesis and Russian propaganda arguments about whether Ukraine is a failed state, and sometimes it was even argued within Western expert community. I think that we have real evidence that Ukrainian state and society was underestimated in this point of view, because now we have the huge level of mutual support, of cohesion of society, and ability to resist. And actually, when foreign media and journalists and my colleagues asked me where we were mistaken about Ukraine, I would say that the ability of Ukrainian society to resist, and actually the ability of Ukrainian army to resist was definitely underestimated, as well as Russian ability to attack was, I would say, overestimated. If we have more safety from the sky, from the air, because my city suffered from the air most, and mostly they provided these bomb shellings from the sky and from the ground, from Belgorod, from Russia Federation side. But actually, I would say that Russian army was extremely unsuccessful when they are moving and try to occupy the city. But unfortunately, people weren't protected from the threats from the sky. So airstrike attacks, they brought most massive damages, but Russian army and I would say Russian groups which were active in Kharkiv and taken more broadly in the eastern Ukraine before, they were unsuccessful in that. So I have a good hope that if some kind of stable situation could be achieved, Ukrainian society will not be the same, definitely, and we now can see the new identity of Ukrainian people, and all people are united. And I even saw recently the results of sociological polls, and they show that 92% of those who are living in eastern Ukraine, comparatively to 86% of those who are living in western Ukraine, they feel this cohesion of Ukrainian society, they feel this brotherhood, they feel this mutual support. So I would say that we will revise definitely our approaches to Ukraine. We will revise our approaches to compare eastern, western part of Ukraine. We will revise our attitudes to elites, and definitely we are witnessing now the attempts to create a real European nation and maybe one of the strongest society in European space. But we need to save Ukraine, and we need to rebuild Ukraine after the conflict. And of course, we need to implement some strategies to prevent Russian attacks in future.
Yes. Yuliya, and your research on civil society and decentralization is absolutely excellent, and I urge everyone to take a look at Yuliya's research. Natalia, your research has also focused on issues around identity and decommunization practices and so on, kind of linking up to what Yuliya was just talking about. Could you tell us a little bit more how you think that informs what's happening on the ground?
Yes, as a social linguist, I focus on people's attitudes towards different languages in Ukraine, primarily Ukrainian and Russian, as well as on various language-related issues. In my research on decommunization renaming in the southeastern city of Kryvyi Rih, I explored a grassroots initiative who initiated the renaming process in the city and suggested a list of place names to be changed under the decommunization laws. Drawing on the initiative's renaming suggestions and the interviews with the initiative members, I revealed a very strong bottom-up movement which sought to get rid of the communist past and completely erase this page from the city's history. And this is in Dnipro Oblast in the southeast of Ukraine. This tells us that in defining their identity, people in southeastern Ukraine have taken a route which is quite opposite to the one taken in Russia. Rather than cherishing the common Soviet past, Ukrainians have been defining themselves individually and separately from these imagined commonalities. They have also been defining themselves in terms of their future perspectives and goals. That is to say, in terms of who they want to be, rather than in terms of who they might have been in the past. My research of language attitudes in Kherson showed that though the majority of local school children use Russian as the main means of communication, they strongly identify with Ukraine by choosing Ukrainian as their native language and as the most important language in Ukraine. My current research on teaching and learning Ukrainian in Russian-speaking communities shows that besides a language for identification, after the Euromaidan, Ukraine has been increasingly seen as a language of communication. This not only signals a building trajectory for the inclusive civic identity, but also mirrors a stronger confidence in the country's sovereignty and in the stability of the Ukrainian language as a symbol of its independence. To sum up, my research suggests that the perception of the southeastern Ukraine as having a kind of pro-Russian sentiment is no longer valid. That the ethnic identity narrative is not the leader narrative in Ukraine. That one's language of communication does not point to one specific political orientation. That Ukrainians perceive themselves to be independent and define their identity in terms of multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism. Thank you.
Absolutely, Natalia. And this is something that has been echoed by so many people that are coming to Ukraine for the first time watching this tragedy unfold, and they don't understand. And I think Yuliya and Natalia's research together helps us show that the local decentralized element here in resisting Russian occupation is hugely important, in part due to a very successful policy. And Natalia's research really showed for years already this perceived to be unlikely communities in the southeast of Ukraine, Russian-speaking Ukrainians that are attached to the state in a very profound way. I think this research is so important to help us understand what's happening on the ground. I'm going to turn now to Timofii. What could you add to help us understand what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. I will second what my colleagues just said. And I will try to break my answer in three parts, also about policy, then about national identity, and then something about methodology of social science. So in terms of policy, our team at Kyiv School of Economics, we have studied decentralization as well. And we have studied the impact of procurement policies, transparent procurement policies, such as the online platform Prozoro, for instance. So our sociological surveys, sometimes, we collected our own data, sometimes we analyzed secondary data that was publicly available, but all these data have shown an increase in trust to local authorities after the reform of decentralization was implemented. So it was clear to us that the reform was quite successful. It allowed local communities to spend budgets much better, to be satisfied with local services, to be satisfied with their mayors. We also saw an increase in trust to family doctors during the pandemic. And for instance, increase in some participatory practices like participatory budgets, and in some cases, even increase in turnout during the elections. So this policy has contributed significantly. We have known for a long time that Ukrainians, they have this resilience and social capital, but they lacked institutions basically to facilitate and cement this social capital. And now these institutions were implemented. The same we can say, about some successful reforms in economics, like procurement system Prozoro, or some success of National Bank of Ukraine. So we see businesses and civil servants who have become much more resilient themselves and much more professional. So we have quite a lot of people who are, ready to the task. So we have civil servants, we have businessmen, we have city mayors, people who were more kind of educated, they have more capacity, they're more savvy. So I think that Ukrainian society has received a lot of tools and devices just to become more professional society. And this certainly helped during the times of crisis. So this was the policy side. Then talking about civic identity, local identities, national identities, language practices, I think we have seen so many volumes, collective volumes. Like there was this collective monograph in English language by the Institute of Sociology at the Academy of Science of Ukraine. There was this volume in post-Soviet affairs where Olga Onuch also contributed. There was another volume by St. Gallen University. So many data was produced, and all these different data, qualitative data, cross-sectional data, panel data, they have all indicated that there have been this increase in civic attachment, in proudness of being Ukrainian among different segments of Ukrainian society, in different regions, macro regions, and among different age cohorts. So it's not a surprise that Ukrainians are quite united right now. It's not exponential, it is incremental. The process has been quite long. And then I will also shortly comment on, from the general perspective of methodology in social science, I think, and this is my pledge to our audience, there have been quite a lot of books, essays, and papers about Ukraine and Russia. And I highly advise you to filter out and pay specific attention only to those papers that are based on data and hypothesis and just scientific reasoning. Qualitative data, quantitative data, media analysis, text analysis, in-depth interviews, experiments, some modeling, whatever. It just has to comply with scientific methods. We have seen an increase of scholarships like that in Ukraine, in both Ukrainian language and English language, and it is essential to follow this scholarship. Unfortunately, in my personal view, all other scholarship has failed. We have a lot of big narratives and essays about spirit of the nation and civilization and whatever, like mysticism about Russia and Ukraine. Do not be fooled by this scholarship. And I think if you just follow a scientific scholarship, you will learn a lot about Ukraine, and you won't be surprised to see news about Ukraine. Yeah, so this is my short input. Thank you.
Well, I think on the types of information that we read and are exposed to, Mariia, you could comment on that. What is your perspective?
Thanks so much. So my sphere of interest is a short story theory, so storytelling, contemporary Ukrainian literature, and comparative studies. In 2019, I presented my paper, The Ukrainian-Russian Cultural War and Storytelling, on the AC's conference in Zagreb. And the topic of that conference was war narratives and narratives of war. Even if you didn't read such works as The War We Took in Vietnam, Conflict and Storytelling, you definitely understand how narratives may shape the war. As, for example, as a phrase, Russian worship, go fuck yourself, that was said by Roman Hribov from a Sheikh Island. And this phrase became a frame of this war. So I will tell key points from my paper. So Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and that caused an outburst of war literature in Ukraine, novels, sketches, short stories, essay diaries, and memories. And they were written by militaries, volunteers, witnesses, and writers. Actually, 95% of contemporary Ukrainian literature about war was written by not writers, by witnesses, militaries, and volunteers. And a lot of these books are translated in English, like Apricot of Donbass by Lyubov Yakimchuk, Voice of the War, Stories of Veterans, its collective stories, Artem Chek, Point Zero, The Orphanage by Serhiy Zhadan, Loss by Olesya Chromeychuk, Daughter by Tamara Horikha-Zernya. And I decided to compare Russia is also taking active part in that war. So I decided to check literature there. And obviously there are no Russian novels, sketches, short stories, essay diaries, memoirs that were written by people who occupied Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk. But there is another huge and massive cluster of literature in Russia about Ukrainian-Russian war. And it has one feature. All that literature about contemporary Ukrainian-Russian war appeared in 2009, not in 2014 or after 2014, earlier in 2009. From 2009 started appearing such novels as Independent Ukraine, Collapse of the Project, where Independent Ukraine is called a project. War 2010, Ukrainian Front, or The Battlefield is Ukraine, Broken Trident, or War 2011. These books were presented, they got awards, literary awards like Starbridge, and they took part in festivals, different war fantasy festivals. And one of them even was in Kharkiv. So there is a literary festival, Starbridge. It's a festival of war fantasy, and it is held in Kharkiv since 1991 till 2014. And this festival is supposed to connect two countries, but of course, only books that are written in Russian can be nominated. And so we may see how Russian culture and events serve to promote propaganda. It's not a mistake. Contemporary Ukrainian-Russian war was depicted before it happened. And all that Russian books are describing near future in Ukraine, where Ukraine is in a state of civil war. US forces come to intensify the chaos and violence, and therefore Russian forces came to protect Russian-speaking people and end civil war. These books are cheap. You can buy it for $1. They're easy available, and there is a lot of discussions around them. Also, some of books might describe different scenario. For example, by the initiative of United States of America, the Third World War started, and it started on the land of Ukraine. And Russian forces came to save Ukrainian land and stop the world tragedy. All war actions are depicted as inevitable. When actual war started, a lot of Russian media started writing about the war as divination. So great Russian writers, they predicted the war because they are so talented, so they can foresee the future, and they are very sensible for injustice. Some authors were born in Ukraine, but they work and live in Russia. So it was assumed that this author foresee and witness how Ukrainians are splitted and miserable. If in all Ukrainian war literature, war is depicted as invasion, in Russian literature, depicted civil war, where Ukrainians are fighting against Ukrainians and they need help. Ukrainian authors depict invasion, aggression, violation of international war, and they describe Ukrainians from different regions. They are speaking different languages, different genders, but they are united by the threat. So in Ukrainian literature, war literature, Ukrainians are extremely active. In Russian books, they are extremely passive. It's very easy to conquer them. No one wants to stand for independence. If war in Russia is imagined, war in Ukrainian books is witnessed. The authors of all that books are politologists, writers, and one author is participant of war in Afghanistan. But 95% of war literature in Ukraine are written by witnesses. Also, many writers, poets, and journalists went to defend borders. And also a lot of texts are written by veterans. If war in Ukrainian literature is deeply connected with trauma, in Russian books, it's connected with mission. Russian literature depicts desire to finish mission, to stop the war, to reconnect republics, and so on and so on. Also, a nice feature, all that Russian books are low quality and Ukrainian texts are predominantly high quality. And media even speculate on that fact. Media claims that Ukrainian authors are so egalitarian and they are writing unrealistic stuff, but only low quality literature is up to date and express the high truth. So my two common conclusions: do not underestimate Russian propaganda. I also wrote a book review for academic peer-reviewed journal on the book This Is Not a Propaganda, War Against Reality by Peter Pomerantsev, and he exposed that massive amount of professionals are involved in making and spreading Russian propaganda. So do not underestimate it. And there is such thing as not direct support of Russian propaganda. Sometimes people, researchers, journalists might share ideas that doesn't look like propaganda, but they are basic for Russian imperial myths and nostalgia. And that include usage of terminology. Also, journalists might not know the region, might not be familiar with Russian propaganda machine, so they might make mistakes. So also I have a few points of not direct support of Russian propaganda that are used today. First of all, it's terminology. Putin called Russian invasion a special operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. It was forbidden to use word war in Russian media. Also, leading world media keep calling Russian-Ukrainian war Ukrainian crisis. There is no crisis in Ukraine. There is in Russian invasion and war or full-scale military invasion. Language is not only a way of communication, but also a way people see the world. In linguistics, it is called linguistic relativity or Shapiro-Wolf hypothesis. And the phrase crisis in Ukraine is misleading as it doesn't speak of anyone's responsibility. For readers that doesn't know context, it sounds like some unfortunate event. So call it Russian military invasion in Ukraine and make polite comments when you see misuses. Also, there is another not direct spreading of Russian propaganda, and it's a brotherhood. It's actively spread by Russian media and Russian civilians used to threat Ukraine as part of their land and ignoring the fact of existing separate Ukrainian identity. I know some people from Russia, they hate Putin and their government, but in general, they have the same Soviet mentality, and they doesn't respect Ukraine or other republics from former USSR. If you ask them, they will tell you that Ukraine and Russia are one people, one nation, and that is also a huge problem when media are commenting that Ukraine and Russia are really familiar. We share history, but it doesn't mean that we are the same. And in general, Russians doesn't feel wrong about invading Ukraine because of that myth of brotherhood. And the majority of Russians were excited about annexing Crimea. And in their imaginations, it was reunion. So they wasn't rebelling and doing rallies in 2014, and they started expressing concerns when only sanctions was applied. Only right now, ordinary Russians feel pressures from Western sanctions and from their authoritarian regime. They began to tell that they're innocent and they are against the war, but definitely they were supporting this myth of reunion, myth of getting back the Crimea. And if there were no destructive sanctions for Russian economy, the majority of Russian people won't even be bothered to say something against war in Ukraine. And as the founder and editor-in-chief of Mohyla Media reminded us, Russian writer Sergei Dovlatov once said, "We endlessly curse Comrade Stalin, and of course for the cause, and yet I want to ask, who wrote the 4 millions of denunciations?" So we are dealing not only with a military attack, violation of international law, terrorism, but also we are working with imperial narratives that stuck in minds of million people, that became a beliefs, a justification, a mission. And that is why—
Mariia, we if you could just wrap up, because you gave us a very incredible presentation, but we have many other questions to go. I think you said some really important things, that some of the propaganda that we are seeing today is not new, of course, and that there's a long history, both in literature and popular culture in Russia, that we can turn to and identify these differences. I'd like to now move to Alexander very quickly, because I don't know how much you want to tell us about your research on monetary policy, but I think you can help us better understand how the sanctions work against the banks in Russia. What are the pressures on the Russian ruble? And perhaps we can also tag into our next question. What are some of the miscalculations and mistakes maybe that the Russian finance sector made before this context?
Yes, absolutely. So just like you said, I'm not going to talk much about monetary policy. That was more relevant before the war. I'll answer your question about the mistakes made by the Russian government and the sanctions. So what we saw in Russia, it was actually very interesting over the years, was that the Russian leader built up an incredible amount of reserves. They have all these funds, essentially sovereign wealth funds, if you want to have several, actually they have different names. But the thing is, they were building up these reserves over the years. And in 2020, we saw something that was very unusual. We saw the COVID crisis, and when all the world, all developed nations and developing nations were using those reserves essentially, or government funds that they had, and were actually building up debt to support the economy and support the people directly, what we saw in Russia is that despite having a big buffer of reserves, they weren't being used at all. Now, with hindsight, we can say that this was a very, very ominous sign, right? Now we know what these reserves were actually meant for, right? They were never meant for the people. They were meant for this. And this was what, what the Russian leader had in mind for years. I mean, now I understand it was a carefully planned operation. The idea was to build such an amount of reserves that Russia would be insulated or could essentially protect itself from the hit that it would receive inevitably from the sanctions. And that's what they did. And so now when the war broke out, we can see that the Russians are trying to use these reserves in order to support their economy to some extent. They're buying these banks that are going bankrupt and so on. But at the same time, one mistake that they clearly made is that probably they did not expect that the West would actually freeze a big chunk of the central bank's reserves, right? Which are not just in dollars, but also in euro. But even if you just have hard currency like gold or anything, nobody's going to buy that now because nobody wants to transact with a party that is under sanctions. Can you hear me? Sorry, the connection is bad. So what I'm saying is, even if you have hard currency, gold, nobody's going to buy that or wants to buy that from the Russians now because nobody wants to transact with a side that's heavily under sanctions. So this is probably a mistake that the Russian side did. They didn't expect that they would essentially have their reserves frozen. And now they're facing serious trouble because we see that the ruble is just collapsing, and all the time. Now it's just about 150 per dollar, just earlier today. And it's probably in free fall still. It's probably going to fall more, especially so the only thing that is now supporting the ruble is actually the real economy. So they issued an order, actually, because the central bank is unable to stabilize the currency. They issued an order for Gazprom and all the real sector firms to support the currency, right? So Gazprom is using its reserves to actually buy rubles. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay, so that's very unusual. But if the West stops actually buying Russian gas and oil, then they will be in very serious trouble, because then even the real sector won't be able to buy rubles and somehow support the currency, and they're failing now anyway. So that's probably was a mistake on their part. They probably didn't anticipate that to such an extent, but that's where we are. So I'll probably conclude here because time is running out and also the connection is pretty poor.
By the way, we can hear you perfectly, and I think that's hugely informative what you told us about. Natalia, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more also from your perspective. What are some of the miscalculations or some of the misunderstandings, mistakes, or even colleagues in the West that have been tangentially studying Ukraine at times? Where have those mistakes been in your eyes, or miscalculations?
Well, I think that it would be a blunder to analyze Ukraine in terms of dichotomies, such as West versus East, the pro-European part of Ukraine and the pro-Russian part of Ukraine, or Ukrainian speakers versus Russian speakers. It would not even be a simplification. It would render impossible any adequate understanding of what's going on here and of Ukraine as a country in general. It has been vividly shown that, for example, language does not predict a specific identity. And this whole paradigm, which interprets Ukrainian speakers as pro-Western and Russian speakers as pro-Russian, is dead. This paradigm is dead. Another assessment, which is fundamentally wrong, is calling the Russian war in Ukraine as a Ukrainian crisis. And here I'm repeating Mariia. The view implied in the label Ukrainian crisis does not only exclude Russia, the aggressor and the occupant, from the scene, but it is also informed by this inappropriate dichotomic understanding of Ukraine, seen as if it were torn by some internal contradictions. Ukraine is not a divided country, and there was a question, I spotted already a question about whether it's part of Russian propaganda. I totally agree with that it is a part of Russian propaganda to portray Ukraine as a divided country, as if it has been torn by sort of contradictions and people do not understand each other here. Ukraine has been more unified now than ever before, and this is the starting point for any kind of analysis on Ukraine.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm going to go now next to Timofii. In your view, what are some of the misunderstandings and miscalculations, but also perhaps on the other side of things, what are some of the unexpected successes, if we might be so bold to call them that, on the Ukrainian side?
Do you mean miscalculations by the West, whether they miscalculated Ukraine, or do you mean that the Ukrainians miscalculated themselves? What do you mean?
I mean, outside actors who miscalculated about Ukraine, and perhaps some of the successes that just show exactly how that is the case.
Okay, well, I think it was very easy to miscalculate Ukraine by everyone, by Russians and by Western scholars, because I think of, well, I can relate to what has been said already, and to reiterate what I was saying in my previous comment, that the information that Western NGOs, researchers, and politicians received about Ukraine has been of very low quality and not always was based on scientific research. And I think the deep fundamental reason for that is that for many, many years in both Russia and Ukraine, political elites paid money to run analysts. So I think that it was beneficial for, like Party of Regions and other pro-Russian parties in Ukraine, and also to Russian-backed parties. And of course, it was beneficial for Russian propaganda to portray Ukraine as a divided nation between West and East, because all this in-group, out-group language is so powerful, to influence your electoral base. And the echo of this narrative has arrived to the West, and somehow everyone believed it. Ukrainian media experts who talk to me also believe this narrative. Some of Ukrainian scholars, for some reason, also believe this narrative, and Russian scholars believe this narrative, and everyone were pushing this narrative to the West, except those few scholars who actually use data. So I think the fundamental reason for this miscalculation is that for many years, people used unreliable narratives. And I'll give you a practical example. So it was the cabinet of Zelensky. When Zelensky just arrived to be a president, he invited a lot of new people to his cabinet, a lot of people younger and people from civil society or from business circles. So there was this new minister of culture. He previously was in one of the largest media organizations in Ukraine. And immediately, so many members of this new cabinet, they started to look around. They hired advisors, they hired scholars. And I went to many meetings like that. I went to one minister, to another minister, and they all were saying the same. They were saying, we need to understand Ukraine. All these previous political elites, they were not so smart and wise like we are, but we will make concrete steps to understand Ukraine, and we will hire you as researchers to help us to understand Ukraine. And for 1 second, I was pleased. I thought like, okay, finally, we can talk about real science. And then immediately, my hopes were shattered because these people immediately started to repeat all these narratives. They were saying like, Timofii, help us to understand. Ukraine is so divided between West and East. How can we close this gap? How can we bridge this gap? So those people who were asking me for analytical advice already framed their questions in this way, so I could not even answer to this question because the question was built on false narrative. So I think this is one of the reasons that so many other external actors miscalculated Ukraine, because internal actors were also using outdated narratives and outdated scientific knowledge, if any scientific knowledge. And finally, we are closing this gap because finally we are providing now more state-of-the-art knowledge. So so I think to answer to your question shortly, the whole Ukraine was miscalculated because of these narratives that were so massive. And about successes, I think that one of the unexpected success which we witness right now is increase of support and trust to national institutions, like president, prime minister, heads of administrations, police. There has been a trend of increasing trust to local administration, increase trust to army, and increase trust to volunteers. Nevertheless, all other institutions like president or prime minister or heads of administrations of regions, they were not trusted, they were not endorsed, they were not supported. And now this has changed dramatically because right now, the government provides only strong, verified, one voice policy built messages to support Ukraine. The president is, of course, he's leading the country, and there is this massive support in the Ukrainian population. And this is quite unprecedented and deserves acknowledgement and respect.
Thank you, Timofii. We have loads of questions. I didn't even see how many questions were in the question box. So we're going to shift away from some of our pre-planned points of discussion. And I'm going to put a few out, and then you all just raise your hands using the raise hand function. Who wants to answer first? But I'll think, first we'll give Yuliya the floor. And I have the first three questions are, so Robin Kirk from Duke University wants to know, what is the best way to help for civil society, what is the best way for civil society, especially for universities, to help? I assume that Robin's talking about universities from abroad, so maybe Yuliya, you can handle that. And another good question here from Gerardo Otero is, what are the key criteria that the European Union will consider that Ukraine does not fulfill for membership? So what are the things that Ukraine needs to do to be able to fulfill the criteria for membership that might be actually connected to industry and financial sector? So maybe Alex, that's something you could touch on. And there were a few questions that we received about saboteurs, and Timofii, you made a reference to that, and a few other people made a reference to that. So Yuliya, why don't we start with you, and then whoever wants to go next, just raise your hand and we'll go to.
Well, many thanks for that questions. I'm not only the scholar, I'm not only the researcher, but actually during previous days, I mostly try to connect the different volunteers group outside of Ukraine and within Ukraine, and we try to build this chain of supplies, humanitarian aid to Kharkiv, because it's very hard and people are risking their life just driving the trucks with the meds or with the bread even. Actually, I would say that having a lot of contacts outside of Ukraine and within Ukraine, I faced with these questions. I was questioned a lot about how we can be helpful. There are different dimensions, and I could say that different communities, Ukrainian diaspora in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the United States of America, in Canada, they were very helpful with the provisions. But actually, we need more sustainable, I would say, strategy to be helpful. One dimension, I would say, is to push decisions, political decisions, which could be helpful for all Ukrainian society or country, second country in general. I mean, political pressure. Make a pressure for your politicians, because a lot of my colleagues, a lot of political scientists and average people in Ukraine, we are really afraid that all this support that we have at the moment, at first it's not enough, and second, it could be very temporary, and a lot of people could be very disappointed if, for example, European Union or Western allies would step back with imposing sanction on Russia. And also how to help, I would say, universities and Ukrainian scholars. I face with the situation that a lot of universities, they open calls for Ukrainian scholars. They want to support Ukrainian scholars. But also I read an announcement that Russian and Belarusian scholars are also welcome. And that is a huge problem for me at the moment, because, for example, me, myself, I recalled some of my application to the conferences where Russian scholars, representatives of Russian institutions, are still present in program, because I have no moral right in the face of more than 2,000 of civilians killed by Russians, just making this, academic, empower these academic ties. So I would say that sanctions should be comprehensive in this way. I don't want to see Russia in the future like a country like USSR, because we were there when everybody in the West said, okay, USSR broken or making the violations of human rights. They have repressions, but they also have a brilliant ballet or the great Russian literature. I think that it is, not very productive. So I really support Mariia in her studies of literature, and I think that culture, research, expertise, academia are also our battle lines, let's say so. So I not implement these double standards. And as to the Karazin University or Kharkiv University or other universities of the eastern Ukraine, maybe you know that Karazin universities Karazin University was in the top 5 of Ukrainian universities, but buildings destroyed totally. So I have no working place at the moment, and it is very possible that I haven't any apartment or any place to live in Kharkiv. But I try to propose my rector not only provide some kind of opportunities for scholars to leave the country temporarily for their safety and provide and research and be vocal about the university, but also to establish kind of a foundation, legal institution which could be very helpful to rebuild the university, because we lost our buildings, but we didn't lost our professors, students, and our people and our supporters. And also it was a question about how Western institutions, how Western people, how Western experts could be helpful. Please revise your approach to Russia, not only as a regime, but to the society. Because with informational project called Fake X, we try to be vocal and try to try to reach, let's say, Russian society, Russian bloggers, Russian stars, Russian colleagues, and a lot of them, they rejected any approaches to talk about the current situation. They rejected any our requests. They just don't want to talk about that. They are silent about that. So my position that mostly Putin is not the single person. It's kind of collective type of thinking at the moment. So please revise your approach to Russia, at least for the next few years.
Great. So Timofii, do you want to touch on the saboteurs question?
Okay, so should I just describe what's happening there, with saboteurs? So broadly,
yeah, I think people don't understand.
Yeah, so broadly, Russia has used these tactics. This tactic has been identified and, addressed already. So the playbook is very simple. They sent people in advance, maybe 5 people, 10 people, 20 people. So they come to Ukraine, they arrived in Ukraine in advance, they rented apartments somewhere in the city center or suburbs, in Kyiv, Kharkiv, whatever. And these people were then used either as spies, to collect information about local military infrastructure, or even to target airstrikes. So our police and our territorial defense immediately identified special color marks, which these saboteurs were leaving. They were leaving on roofs of civilian buildings, and they were leaving these marks on military or civil infrastructure, like bridges. So the idea was that they were helping to target airstrikes. So our local administration of different cities, city mayors, for instance, they distributed this information. So civilians should be very careful. If they see someone suspicious, they should call police. Or if they see marks, they should destroy the marks or call the police. We were walking around searching, for these marks ourselves. I know personally people who did discover these marks and destroy them, or maybe called to some professionals. I have family, members and friends who identified saboteurs because they were not even hiding. Basically, they were unprofessional Russian-speaking individuals with very thick Russian accent. I think they simply, I don't know what happened. I don't know who provided intelligence to this guy. I don't know who was their chief officer, but it looks like they did not realize that Ukraine is a sovereign nation with separated culture, and it's so easy to identify them. You just send a very simple signal. You start talking in Ukrainian language with these guys, and they don't know how to answer. So these signaling effects were so crucial, and so many civilians actually noticed these guys and called on police, called police on them. Unfortunately, some of these saboteurs are armed. and some of them are professional. So there were, there were local combats on the streets of Kyiv. Our territorial defense and our police force was engaged in combats with these saboteurs. Some of these saboteurs, they dressed as civilians. They used ambulance car to drive around. So, it was crazy. It was like you watch a movie, about spies and action and whatever, but it was just a real action in the streets of my city. So right now, everyone is alarmed. Everyone is trying to pay attention, to search for the saboteurs and, to fight them back, to arrest them, or to call police on them.
Great, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'll briefly comment on the question about EU accession. So obviously that doesn't happen overnight. Right now, we've just filed our application for candidacy, right? And so then we will be granted candidacy, hopefully at some point. For that, only a majority of the EU Parliament has to agree, essentially the majority of the states. And after the candidacy status, then we'll begin negotiations. And usually negotiations for accession take years, right? So even for countries that were, relatively developed and ready, it took years, 5, 4, 6 years, depending on which country. So we don't know exactly how long it's going to last, but that's when this process becomes linear. So you have a set of criteria that you have to fulfill. And here the Copenhagen criteria is sort of the rules of the game of 1993. They were accepted as kind of the criteria that need to be fulfilled. And generally that's how the process is regulated. And then once you fulfill one criteria, you move to the next. So this is a linear process and can take a long time. Obviously, Ukraine has still a long way to go in terms of its institutional development, even before the war, right? So we know that in terms of the quality of our institutions, the quality of our infrastructure, the democracy is much more developed than in the region, but still, some people have, there's these rankings of democracy and we're not at the very top and so on. And obviously when it comes to economic freedom as well. So there's a long way to go, but once that's done, then there's the actual accession. So you need a consensus for that once the negotiations are done. So you need a EU consensus for that. So all 27 members have to say yes. And there are states that block different accessions of different countries with which there is sort of a negotiation going on for different reasons. But anyway, so long story short, this of course doesn't happen overnight. What I think is happening right now is there's an urgency in light of the war for the EU to kind of give us a hand essentially, and by any means possible, and to send a very clear signal to Russia that, listen, we're going to help Ukraine. We're not going to just let it fall. And you're not going to be able to occupy it or anything. So in other words, this is, of course, a political sign. I think there's no secret about this. And this is a sign of political help that we're getting. But that doesn't mean that tomorrow, of course, we're going to be in the EU. It's a long process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Obviously, we can't possibly get to all 40 questions in the chat. A lot of our listeners are also saying, viewers saying that, Mariia, you had such an insightful comments made. Natalia, there's a question to you. Would you say that the past communist culture has been conflated with Russian language? Is this a valid conflation? That's from Jardo Otero again. And perhaps I can ask one final question here from Frank Sisson to anyone who wants to pick it up. Perhaps Mariia, you would like to. Would any of our speakers wish to discuss the religious dimension of the war, especially the role of the, I believe, I actually don't know right now what the UOCMP with Ukrainian society and the degree to which it propagated the Russian world. So yeah. So the fifth column component of the Russian, I'm assuming that's the Orthodox Church. So who wants to take a stab at those two questions first? Mariia, perhaps?
Well, Ola, you asked me about the conflation of Russian language, yes, and communism.
So has the past communist culture, is it conflated with Russian language, and is that a valid conflation?
Well, if you want a very short answer, it will be no. No. And if speaking from my own research, and Timofii is making a very good point that you should trust research based on data. So my research from Kherson tells you, I asked school children about their associations with Russian language, and their answers were that it is a language I speak with my friends. It is a language I speak at home. It is the language that everyone in my region in Kherson Oblast understands. So these associations with communism, they are not alive anymore. There's 30 years since we've been not a part of this Soviet Union and all of the stories related to that. And people here, they don't already remember about this stuff. Older generation, yes, but younger generation, and especially school children, they don't. So I don't think that it is a valid conflation and that it should be taken seriously.
Does anyone want to pick up the question about the religion and fifth column?
Well, I can say shortly, unfortunately, I have not monitored the situation well, so I don't have nice data. Nevertheless, there were media reports, and these reports were also, they were in channels, official channels as well, that some of priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which we often call as the Moscow Patriarchate, some of these priests were actually recruited as saboteurs themselves, and there were cases when they also left marks. So I think one has to understand that for many years, Russia has used educational, cultural, media sources, and also church as a powerful, component of their soft power influence and propaganda. And this is eye-opening to many people now. And yeah, I just think we should pay more attention to that.
Mariia, Yuliya, go ahead. Maybe Mariia first.
Yeah, I will just make a quick comment that I were helping to translate Ukrainian materials to one Canadian journalist who is making a big reportage about Russian church that is helping to make sabotage, and also in one Russian church the armor was found that was supposed to use against Ukrainians. So I hope soon this material will be published, but there is a lot of cases when Russian priests were doing sabotage and Russian church was used against Ukrainians.
Yulu?
I would like to add that mostly I'm not about narratives or the spirit that they bring into to people, but also I try to investigate organizational networks related to Moscow Patriarchate Orthodox Church, namely in Kharkiv, in particular in Kharkiv. And actually, they were related with the Cossacks organization, which which were very active during the Russian Spring and establishing so-called people republics in Donbass. And the another ties that they have in Kharkiv, it was the association of former security service officers, and when you visit their local site, you can see that it wasn't security service of Ukraine, but actually it was veterans of KGB, and they tried to promote this idea of Caribbean crisis, of Afghanistan war with the Russian narrative, and actually they were very active in visiting schools and providing the lessons of let's say patriotic education for Kharkiv pupils. So I would say that it was a very developed network of organization, but at the moment I'd say they tried to increase the public trust because they understood that they need people, not only the governments from Moscow, but they need people who trusted in them and could provide some charity and could make them alive. But actually they were very close to very different Russian structures.
Okay, I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I knew this was going to happen because this is what happens when you bring scholars from Ukraine that know what they're talking about, that can communicate efficiently and have loads to tell us. So I do hope that we can have you back, whether it's at ASN Virtual or hopefully at another conference, because you are the people that we all are very much needing to hear from, and your insight. I'm going to now turn the virtual floor to Zsuzsa.
Thank you, Olga. And I'm also just going to say, essentially repeat what you said, that this was really extraordinarily powerful. Since the beginning of the invasion, we have heard experts on many venues speaking about the war, analyzing, speculating, but there have been really few places where we could hear from scholars living in Ukraine right now, knowing what they're talking about, analyzing. And I must say that you are really sending a very powerful message. If Ukrainian scholars are providing the quality of analysis that we have heard here, living under siege by Putin's Russia, while also pulling their weight in the Ukrainian resistance as volunteers, advisors, whatever they need to do, then I think Ukraine will recover. And to all our colleagues in Ukraine, I just want to say, stay strong, stay safe. And to our audience, we will be back on March 16th with our third panel that we're organizing about the war, focusing that time on the regional and larger geopolitical implications. Please stay tuned. We will be sending out the announcement about that. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, everyone. Natalia, Timofii, Mariia, Yuliya, Alexander, Mariia, and stay safe, stay strong. See you back.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.